The long-awaited sequel to The Last of Us has finally arrived, and boy did it cause a shitstorm on the internet. Don't let the review bombings fool you. The general opinion for this game is more divided than unanimous. Some people praise it while others think it's an abomination of a sequel. While the gameplay and the environments are pretty well polished, that is not what has caused such a stir in the community. The Last of Us was never a game that blew people away with its gameplay. Instead, people fell in love with the story, which was so well written that it was used to reignite the "are video games art" debate when the game came out. People were so excited to see how the story would continue, especially after the emotional note the first game ended on. Unfortunately, the sequel didn't really live up to its predecessors. In fact, the writing has led people to straight up hate everything about this game. But why? That's what I want to talk about. I'm going to break down what I believe are the flaws with the narrative that have disappointed players, including me, and how its true message was lost with the storytelling. Now, before we get into the flaws, let's address what is by far the most useless point of criticism I've seen people make. The agenda. Or more specifically, the gay agenda. Now, before you all start typing your comments saying that no one cares and no one is complaining about this, if you look at the timeline of the video, you will see that it has been divided into segments, each labeled with the title of the topic that segment discusses within the video. So if you don't want to listen to this part, feel free to just skip it. However, the fact of the matter is that you still have a vocal minority of people that are complaining about there being some sort of agenda. Hell, someone left me a comment saying that they'd unsubscribe from my channel if I dared to say I like this game that clearly has an agenda. To pretend that people complaining about this don't exist would be a disservice to the struggle the LGBTQ community has with just being accepted as a normal part of society. Besides, this is also a good opportunity to help dispel the myth that is the gay agenda. Yes, my people, you heard right. I called it a myth. Why do you ask? Because the existence of LGBTQ people or people of color is not a political statement. They exist, just like the rest of humanity. Therefore, they have every right to be included and represented in pop culture media. The agenda, or the gay agenda, are terms that are normally used to disregard or disparage the advocacy for cultural acceptance and normalization of non-heterosexual orientations and relationships. In other words, people cry agenda when they see it being presented to them in pop culture, like say, a popular video game. The same can also be applied to people of color who are represented. The term itself implies that any form of media that attempts to show anything non-heterosexual is attempting to indoctrinate viewers into believing in a political ideology. What political ideology exactly? A terrible and dangerous ideology that will lead to the ruin of mankind. That gay people exist and should be treated the same as other humans. I know I sound like I'm mocking this, and that's because I am, but that's because the gay agenda is a ridiculous claim that implies the LGBTQ community are attempting to make a political statement whenever they are being represented in media, when the reality is that acknowledging LGBTQ people isn't a political issue. It's a human rights issue. People who cry agenda claim that they make this content simply to get supporters, but I have to ask, supporters for what? What cause is Naughty Dog trying to rally people behind when they created The Last of Us Part 2? I invite you to answer this question for me in the comments below, because my understanding is that if there is an agenda they would want to get supporters to believe, it's that LGBTQ people are a normal part of society. This is why I usually am very dismissive of people that cry agenda, because it is really just an emotional response to any LGBTQ character being the focus of a story. The wild part, however, is that their sexuality isn't even the focus of the plot. Look, if you view representation as an agenda that is trying to gain supporters and therefore dislike it, then I can only assume it is because you are against it, which implies you're against LGBTQ people being represented in the media. Then we have to question why you're against that, and, well, I'll leave you to reflect on that, cause that's a whole rabbit hole I'm not gonna get into right now. Also, as I said earlier, all of this can also be applied to people who cry agenda when it's people of color on screen as well. Now see, I like my people, and I want to be fair to my people, so when I saw that comment I mentioned earlier, you know, the one that threatened to unsubscribe, I decided to play through this game to see what could make them think there was an agenda. Unfortunately, it looks like I'm going to lose a subscriber because I just found the same tired old excuse for crying agenda, that gay people exist. Also, this same person said Abby was trans and that the cult in the game were Christian religious fanatics that hunt down gay people. And that is just so telling of what people who cry agenda are like. Y'all don't even look at the actual story or game before talking shit about it. Y'all are such a vocal group too that if anyone has any criticisms of the game, they get dismissed as being a part of your group, which is just as infuriating because LGBTQ people don't want special privileges. They want equality. Therefore, work that represents them shouldn't be seen as inherently greater or lesser simply because they are included. This game has plenty of flaws, but the fact that LGBTQ people or people of color exist within it is not one of them. I understand that there are people who are not annoyed by this at all, and have legitimate criticisms directed towards the game's writing. I'm sorry that your voices may have been dismissed thanks to this crowd of people. Nonetheless, I felt it was worth addressing because simply ignoring that these people exist is almost insulting to the struggle that the LGBTQ community has with being accepted as a normal part of society. And it was also a good opportunity to help dispel the myth that is the gay agenda. Now with that being properly addressed, let's actually talk about the story and my understanding of the flaws within it. I should preface this with the fact that I am not a professional writer, nor am I a reviewer. I never established my channel as such. I am just someone who played the game and has an opinion on it, just like anyone else. But I'm making this video anyway because, despite how divided the opinions are surrounding the game, I don't think there's been enough discussion about it beyond just calling the story dog shit. I also want to address what I believe was behind the attempt with the several baffling storytelling decisions that were made, while sprinkling in some psychology like I always do. We'll be moving from the small stuff to what seems to be unanimously regarded as the most glaring issue within the game. Now to start us off, the pacing of the story is so out of order it hurts. A significant portion of the game's story is told through flashbacks that are sprinkled in after completing certain segments of the main story. Ellie's flashback scenes are written pretty well and actually serve a story purpose that I'll get into later, but there are several of these flashbacks that essentially keep making us hop from one time to another repeatedly. I am not a fan of this method of storytelling. This is not to say that I hate flashbacks because they can be used well. One flashback I really enjoyed was Joel's birthday gift for Ellie. It didn't simply give us a break from the brutal violence. It also gave us a window into how Joel and Ellie's relationship continued to develop since the last game, while at the same time giving us a reminder as to why Joel's death was so impactful, and why Ellie is on this journey. For real, this was the cutest father-daughter scene in a post-apocalyptic world that I've seen thus far. This was a really good flashback. But then we get more flashbacks, and now we're trying to piece two different stories together. It's like having two timelines of events, and instead of presenting them chronologically, you present them on top of each other at the same time, which makes the story feel disconnected. Like the story wants us to be invested in Ellie's revenge journey, but then takes us out of it to try to make us feel invested in Joel's lie to Ellie, thinking that it will enhance the other narrative. All that was accomplished by doing so was making us compare the flashbacks to the main story and wonder why they weren't the main focus of the game. Again, I'm not a storyteller, but I think if you're going to tell one story through flashbacks and have it loosely connected to the other story, then maybe you should have just spent time further developing and presenting the flashbacks as like the first half of the game. In my opinion, one of the flashbacks actually seems like a good way to open the game. I'm talking about the second one, which starts off by sniping Infected. We get a look into their new way of life. We got interactions with Tommy, letting us know he's probably gonna have more of a role in this story. We have Ellie feeling bothered by something, giving a bit of dramatic irony considering that we know Joel lied to her, but we can't be 100% sure this is what's on her mind just yet, making us want to get further into the game in hopes of seeing if we're right or not. We got gameplay, but this time controlling Ellie instead of Joel, setting the standard for the rest of the game. Well, half of the game. We got a boss fight that could have served as a tutorial boss. Lastly, to top things off, we get a scene rich in dialogue that sets up the conflict between our two protagonists. We see Ellie press Joel about what happened at the Firefly base. But how does Joel respond? By continuing the lie from the first game. Then, the title drops. See what I mean when I say these flashbacks are written well enough to have been their own chronological segments within the game? I'm not sure why this wasn't the case. It also doesn't help that Abby's segment of the game is presented to us by interrupting what is supposed to be the major climax of the game. Seriously, when they pulled this shit, I wanted to stop playing the game because they stopped the story we cared about in order to play through a completely unrelated story as someone that killed off one of the most integral characters in the whole story. Speaking of which, I understand there are people that are just mad over the fact that Joel died, but this shouldn't discredit the other complaints people have over this scene. I don't think the majority of people actually dislike the fact that Joel dies. It makes complete sense that Joel's past would eventually catch up to him. Instead, what has people so upset over Joel's death is how unbelievably out of character the events leading up to it were. Let's take a minute to reflect on who Joel was established to be in the first game. Joel was a ruthless survivor that has done morally reprehensible things for the sake of survival. As hunters, Joel and Tommy learned how to prey on other survivors for supplies, being unafraid to resort to killing them. This lifestyle proved to be so brutal that Tommy couldn't take it anymore and left to join the Fireflies. It is from his time as a hunter that Joel gained the experience he displays in the first game. Joel knows how to kill whether he's armed or not, how to create weapons out of the scraps he finds, how to tell when people are lying, how to torture information out of people. Hell, we even see Joel literally run into a man with a car because he can correctly recognize an ambush attempt, later on admitting that he was able to recognize the ambush by experiencing them from both sides. Joel is a capable survivor because he not only experienced the brutal yet effective survival tactics that people use, but has also used those very same tactics on other survivors. Therefore, it's hard to believe that the Joel we see during this scene, you know, the one that lets Tommy introduce their names, as well as the fact that they have a settlement nearby, to a group of complete strangers, and allows their weapons to be left in a separate room along with their horses, it's hard to believe that Joel is the same cautious survivor we've seen him be in the first game. I've heard people use the argument that maybe Joel grew soft over the years in Jackson, but I doubt that considering he was part of the patrols that dealt with threats near Jackson. A role that Joel is really well suited for considering what we've seen in the first game. So Joel would still be in situations where he has to, at the very least, rely on his knowledge as a survivor. Also, it's not like Jackson is just a happy-go-lucky safe haven for everyone. Remember how they greeted Joel and Ellie when they first got there? Remember how they deal with raiders? It doesn't make sense for Joel to have gone soft when you take into consideration what was already established in the story. When you have a character put into a situation that completely contradicts how the character was originally written to think and behave, it leaves the audience feeling as if the scene was forced into the narrative, making it very clear that Joel's character was reduced to being a plot device. Now, Joel being a plot device isn't an inherently bad idea. Joel's death is actually a powerful way to ignite a revenge plot for Ellie and the player, which is proven by how much people hate Abby. But its execution made it feel unnatural and betrayed Joel's writing, making it feel like a disservice to a main protagonist that people grew to care about. However, I will admit this scene did evoke a lot of emotion in me. I felt as if a real person I grew close with died. I took my time walking through his house afterwards and experienced the heart-wrenching grief Ellie was going through every time I passed by the remnants of his daily life. Ellie's desire for revenge on the person who took Joel from us felt even more real after this detail. However, this person proved to have more of a purpose within the story. It is clear that she was written with the intention of being more than just the antagonist of Ellie's story. So how was her character handled? Oh, Abby. Where do I begin?
You're a piece of shit, Abby.
Yeah, that's a pretty good place to start. The story did a great job at making people unanimously hate Abby when she was introduced. I can only assume that was the intended goal in order to set up the motivation for Ellie and the player. So well done with that. But I must say, what is done with this character is f***ing bold. You're gonna have a character that commits one of the most heinous acts of violence onto someone the audience adores, and then have that same audience play as that character in hopes of giving them a new perspective that is meant to make them question their hatred for her? That is bold. That is very bold of you, Sir Druckmann. You have to be incredibly confident in your writing to pull off such a feat. And if you ask me, maybe you shouldn't have been. Alright, to be fair, it's actually a very creative way of utilizing the storytelling advantages that video games have to offer. Instead of having to cram the antagonist's perspective in a cutscene, you force us to play as that character. Thus, their adversity becomes our adversity if we want to progress through the game. I'll give credit where credit is due. It is a very creative way of using a video game to make the audience feel the narrative. But it's also one that would take a master storyteller to pull off, because you're trying to make us feel the same level of emotion for these characters without the same amount of time and dedication you gave Joel and Ellie in the first game. Now let's be real, if the first Last of Us actually ended with Joel's death scene from the second game, would you expect people to buy the sequel knowing it's from the perspective of his killer? Frankly, I don't believe that would sell, and that's probably why they never marketed the fact that almost half of the game is spent playing as Abby instead of Ellie. So I can see why fitting it into this game was necessary to try to pull off this narrative. I believe this endeavor could have been accomplished if you didn't make Abby's story disconnected from Ellie's journey. Abby's story is presented as another perspective to Joel and Ellie's journey, a window into what has been the unseen impact of their actions. This is made clear when we learn that Abby is the daughter of one of the doctors Joel killed in order to free Ellie. We are reminded of the fact that the people Joel has killed are not just nameless NPCs, but instead are people with their own unique lives and relationships in this world. I believe this was a good way to establish an antagonist with believable motivations to hunt down Joel. In doing so, she creates a ruthless enemy out of Ellie, thus continuing the cycle of hate. The problem with this, however, is that the rest of Abby's story is entirely disconnected from Ellie's. I like the idea of Abby having a redemption arc concurrent with Ellie's descent into obsessive and murderous hatred. Making Ellie the final boss for both Abby and the player makes sense, because by this point in the story, Ellie has become a villain who murdered so many people that she's becoming more like Joel was prior to meeting Ellie, progressively losing touch with her own humanity. Meanwhile, Abby has been risking her life to save the lives of people who are supposed to be her enemies. In doing so, she has been becoming more in touch with her lost humanity. However, because Abby's story is so disconnected from Ellie's, it makes this encounter feel forced. It doesn't feel like anything that has been built up to from Abby's perspective. From Ellie's perspective, it's been super focused on the goal of killing Abby, so I'm not complaining there. However, you introduce what's supposed to be the climax of the story, then you cut it off, rewind time, and force people to play as Abby through a plot that can literally be ripped out without affecting the rest of the game. The only plot threads connecting Abby and Ellie's experiences were the sniper fight with Tommy and Abby finding the map to lead her to Ellie. This is why I say the final battle didn't feel like something being built up to. Instead, it feels forced in after making the player sit through roughly 10 hours of something completely unrelated. It really feels like they wanted to make a standalone story with Abby, which is fine, but don't do it in the sequel that's supposed to be focused on Ellie's character development. You can't blame the audience for having this expectation when you marketed the game as such. The entire time I was playing as Abby, I was expecting her to see the chaos that Ellie left behind in her search, and how the way she responds to that chaos would be what ultimately redeems her. But that never came. Lev and Yara's story was kind of interesting, but again, completely unrelated to Ellie's story. I do not understand the reasoning for introducing a whole new plot to follow right after cutting off the climax of the story people were made to actually care about. I get you're trying to redeem Abby, but you can't expect people to just forget about Ellie's story while we go on this life-altering retreat with Abby. And while we're on Ellie's story, we have to talk about a question that a lot of people had after completing it. What was the point? After losing her fight with Abby, we have a couple of scenes where we see Ellie try to move on. She has a nice house, a farm, and is raising a baby with her partner. It seems like a happy ending, but then we find out that Ellie really hasn't been able to come to terms with Joel's death at the hands of Abby. Neither has Tommy, who tries to guilt-trip Ellie into continuing her revenge journey, which was just really f***ed up, but understandable. Then we see Ellie make the decision to leave on her own because she believes that she truly cannot be able to heal until Abby is dead. A selfish decision that hurts her relationship with Dina and makes her lose everything, even her ability to play the guitar. From what I've seen, people were left wondering what was the point of the final chapter because Ellie ultimately chooses to let Abby live. I think the reason why people felt like this was pointless goes back to what I was saying earlier about Ellie's flashbacks having a purpose. While the main story highlights Ellie's hatred and thirst for revenge, her flashbacks are all about forgiveness. These flashbacks tell the story of Ellie's relationship to Joel being strained ever since she figured out the lie he had been telling her for years. She no longer feels comfortable around him, and even rejects him from getting involved in her life. With the final flashback, we learn this is because she hasn't been able to forgive him. The very last thing Ellie tells Joel is that she hadn't been able to forgive him, nor does she feel as if she ever will. But she would like to try. Although this might have seemed hopeful for the both of them, Joel was taken away from her before they ever had a chance to come together as adoptive father and daughter. Ellie's inability to forgive is what continued her anger towards him and kept their relationship from healing despite the fact that Joel ultimately loves her. Holding on to the resentment wasn't just damaging their relationship, it was also damaging her own well-being. This is why losing Joel was even more impactful. Joel was taken from her right before they could rebuild their relationship. Understanding the context of these flashbacks helps us put into perspective why Ellie chooses to leave Abby alive. It becomes clear that the story was intended to be about forgiveness, considering that these flashbacks are being told simultaneously with Ellie's journey to kill Abby. While Ellie forever lost her chance to forgive Joel, she still had a chance to forgive Abby. Not for Abby's well-being, but for her own. For Ellie, holding on to her resentment for Joel was ruining her relationship with him and was leaving her with unresolved anger. Holding on to her resentment towards Abby was ruining her relationship with Dina and was slowly leaving her as a shell of her former self. Ellie's journal entries frequently talk about her trauma and even expressed how she feels her journey has emotionally left her with nothing to give to her new family, almost as if she's given up on herself in being able to have any meaningful connections. I can see the ending making sense from this perspective. This story is not about vengeance. It is what starts the story off, but the rest is about the corrosive nature of anger and resentment. It is about how difficult it is to allow ourselves to forgive and the consequences of not being able to. It captures the complexities surrounding forgiveness by presenting inciting incidents that seem impossible to forgive, while also showing the psychological costs of not doing so. It shows how narrow-minded we can be in terms of what we need to heal, and how we can sabotage the little that we have left. I do not blame people for not understanding this point about forgiveness. There are many misconceptions as to what it means, and the story itself isn't put together well enough to highlight this message. To keep going further, we have to understand what forgiveness is and the misconceptions behind it. Oh, you thought I wasn't gonna throw some psychology at you? Who the hell do you think I am? People often think forgiveness is about the person that wronged you, that you are granting them some sort of pass for what they've done. This simply isn't true. Forgiveness is the process of releasing feelings of resentment or vengeance towards a person or group who has harmed you. When someone hurts us, it can feel as if there is an injustice gap, a feeling that the outcome of the event does not match our ideas of justice. In other words, the person who harmed us hasn't been punished appropriately. So people seek to desperately close this gap by seeking revenge, pursuing legal action, or confronting the offenders directly. Closing the gap is thought to bring an end to the negative emotions that come from the pain. Forgiveness is capable of closing that gap and allowing the person to move towards coping with their pain. When you forgive, you are not obligated to reconcile with those who hurt you, because it's not about them. Forgiveness involves acknowledging that your suffering matters, whether or not the other person involved recognizes it, which is what Ellie originally wanted. She wanted Abby to suffer so that she feels every bit of pain that Ellie has felt. Simply putting a bullet in her head or allowing her to be killed by anything else wouldn't have been enough. But it's not like Ellie's pain would suddenly be lifted. Abby's existence isn't what prolongs Ellie's internal suffering. Instead, it's her continuing to hold onto her anger and resentment for what happened. Holding onto those negative emotions is self-destructive, which is shown by the fact that doing so has only made Ellie continue to destroy the things and people she loved. Forgiveness is ultimately about freedom from a mindset that eats away at you physically and psychologically. Forgiveness does not mean you are okay with what happened to you. People think that if you forgive someone, it means you're letting whoever hurt you off the hook, when that's just not true. You can still recognize that what the person did was bad, but when you forgive, you don't let it have control over your actions. You can still pursue justice against the person, but it's not guided by anger or hatred. Forgiveness doesn't mean you forget about what happened. You know the popular saying, forgive and forget? You absolutely do not want to forget when someone has wronged you, if you want to do yourself any justice. This is just asking to have the same or similar injustices repeated onto you. It is possible to forgive and then hold little trust for that person, or even just cut them out of your life altogether. What matters is that the pain they caused no longer controls your every thought. You're taking power away from them and granting yourself control. Forgiveness does not mean you cannot be hurt by whatever the event was. It is completely okay to still recognize the hurt and pain that followed the event after forgiving someone, because it's natural to feel pain. That pain doesn't just magically go away, but you can now focus on coping and healing from it. These misconceptions are widespread enough for many people to believe them, so maybe you could argue that this had something to do with the message being lost on people. But it's not like the story does a good job of making it clear either. Honestly, I believe this issue is more a result of the failings with the storytelling. This is where the most harm was done by the story's pacing. It has the seeds for the forgiveness plot, but scatters them all over the place and introduces filler bullshit for another character. We're taken out of Ellie's revenge journey to follow another plot, not another perspective, another plot altogether, whose conflict has nothing to do with forgiveness. Instead, it's about finding unity with people you previously thought little of because of humanity's inherent sense of tribalism, which is a message that I believe can be applied to these characters and their world, but it's not written to be the focus of Ellie's journey, which is what people care about here. I believe this is why a lot of people miss the point. There's also the fact that this unconnected plot spent so much time redeeming Abby that it made Ellie's actions seem not as impactful to Abby, giving the illusion that Abby got away with her revenge when the fact of the matter is that she did suffer for her decision to kill Joel. Abby lost every single one of her friends, was captured by a group, enslaved, and then left to starve while tied to a post. Those are some pretty hefty consequences. But the story doesn't do anything with those consequences. The story attempts to close the injustice gap for the viewers, but fails to evoke sympathy because the writing of the characters close to Abby just simply does not compare to what they've written for Joel. The first game was entirely focused on Joel and Ellie, which allowed for plenty of time and opportunities to establish them as characters and feel something for them. The second game introduces all these characters and expects you to feel something similar for them as you would for Joel, but by barely giving them any meaningful writing. So when these characters are finally killed, they just feel like any other NPC Ellie has gone through on her rampage. These people die and are pretty much forgotten by both the players and the characters of the story. Who the f felt anything for Nora, Manny, or this guy? Death in general in this story is used mostly for shock value, refusing to spare any respect for the loss, not including Joel. Thus, it fails to make the audience believe that Abby suffered any real consequences for her actions. We don't see what she's lost. We see what she still has, her life and a new child companion. These dead characters matter to Abby, but they don't matter to the audience. You gotta work harder to make the audience care. You can't just rely on people's basic sense of empathy here. I believe this is why people feel as if Ellie's act of forgiveness was out of nowhere and made them think that the story was a half-baked, revenge is bad narrative. While Ellie finally has her realization of what both her and Abby have lost because of their inability to forgive, the audience is left thinking Abby got away with her revenge. I can understand how this seems insulting to people, like the story is wagging its finger at you and lecturing you by saying revenge is bad. Ellie's decision to forgive doesn't have much build-up to it. Ellie's plot is practically put on hold to make Abby objectively be the character with the moral high ground, and lastly, the audience is made to feel as if Abby had no real consequences for being just as bloodthirsty as Ellie was. I see the potential with this story, but I think it wasn't executed well enough to give the intended message. I commend the writers for attempting to write a story about forgiveness, how Herculean that task can be, and depicting realistic consequences because of an inability to forgive. However, the message was lost in its execution of that story. It forces you to participate in almost fetishistic brutality and attempts to make you feel bad for wanting Abby to suffer consequences for her actions. The story's intended message about forgiveness is lost on the player because it doesn't commit to it, leaving people feeling as if they've been lectured to, rather than sparking conversation. This story leaves you feeling absolutely miserable in the end. And that's okay. Not every story needs a happy ending. Ellie has heavy consequences for her actions, the same way that any one of us would. I wouldn't change her ending, but it felt unearned due to how scattered the journey leading up to it was. I think this story had a lot of potential, and was pretty ambitious in the way they attempted to tell it. Of course, there are people that are just mad because Joel died, or because Abby gets to live, or because they think it's some left-wing political SJW agenda bullshit. But don't let them distract you from the people who are disappointed because of the flaws with the storytelling. It's not a perfect game, but I don't think it's the worst game to ever have been created. Even though I've spent time discussing the flaws within the game, I still made sure to mention the strengths this game has to offer. As I've said before, I'm not a reviewer. This is the first time I've ever done anything that resembles a review for a game. But since I spent all this time talking about the game, I might as well give it a rating. The Last of Us Part 2 gets a 6 out of 10 from me. Its ambitious storytelling wasn't met with the same attention to detail as the rest of its features did.